If you want to understand why a patch of ocean thousands of kilometers away can shake economies from India to Africa, you need to picture the Pacific not as water, but as an engine. Under normal conditions, powerful trade winds push warm surface water from the coast of South America toward Asia and Australia. As that warm water moves west, colder, nutrient-rich water rises near Peru. This balance isn't just about ocean temperature. It determines where clouds form, where rain falls, and ultimately, where crops grow. But during an El Niño phase, those trade winds weaken. The entire system slows down, almost like a conveyor belt losing power. Warm water spreads back toward the central and eastern Pacific, shutting down the cold upwelling near South America. And when that happens, the atmosphere responds. Rainfall shifts away from regions that depend on it, India, Southeast Asia, Australia, and concentrates over the ocean instead. The result? Drought in some of the world's most agriculturally dependent economies, and floods in others that aren't prepared for it. Now, here's where the economic chain reaction begins. Take India as a case study. Nearly half of its farmland doesn't rely on irrigation. It relies on the monsoon arriving on time, with the right intensity, and distributed evenly. When El Niño disrupts this cycle, rainfall doesn't just reduce, it becomes erratic. That unpredictability is far more damaging than a simple shortfall. Farmers can't plan sowing cycles, crop yields drop, and suddenly supply projections collapse. And when a country of over 1 billion people faces even a small percentage drop in food production, the pressure doesn't stay local, it spills into global markets. Prices of staples like rice, wheat, and pulses begin to climb, not just because of scarcity, but because of anticipation. Markets price in fear faster than reality. We've seen this play out before. And in a globalized economy, a shock in one region doesn't stay contained. It travels, often faster than policymakers can respond. But here's the most overlooked part of this entire system: timing. Climate events don't just matter, they matter when they happen. And current projections suggest that this El Niño could peak right when India, and much of Asia, depends most on rainfall. That overlap is what turns a manageable disruption into a potential crisis. It's the difference between a bad season and a systemic shock. So now the story shifts from what is happening to who pays the price. Because in every economic disruption, the burden is never evenly distributed. Now comes the part that rarely makes headlines, but quietly defines the real impact of events like El Niño. Because climate shocks don't just disrupt systems, they redistribute pain. And almost always, that redistribution flows in one direction, downward. Start at the bottom of the economic pyramid. In countries like India, hundreds of millions of people work in what economists call heat-exposed sectors: construction workers, delivery riders, street vendors, agricultural laborers. These are not jobs you can shift to air-conditioned environments or remote work. They depend on physical presence, endurance, and long hours under the open sky. Now introduce sustained temperatures above 40 to 45 degrees Celsius. What happens isn't just discomfort, it's biological limitation. The human body begins to fail at maintaining core temperature, fatigue sets in faster, dehydration accelerates, and the risk of heat stroke rises sharply. But here's where it turns economic. When a worker loses even 2 to 3 hours of productive time in a day due to extreme heat, their income drops instantly. There's no buffer, no paid leave, no insurance. At the same time, their expenses increase: more water, basic cooling, occasional medical costs. It's a double hit, earning less while spending more. And for families with children, it's even heavier, with over 1 million students experiencing homelessness each year, some of them sleeping in cars, and then showing up to school the next morning trying to act like everything is normal, carrying something most people around them don't even see. And while many assume shelters are the backup option, in reality they're often full or don't work for people trying to stay employed due to strict schedules, safety concerns, or family separation. So many people skip them entirely because a vehicle offers more control, even if it's far from stable. And on top of all that, in many places it's actually illegal to sleep in your car, which means people already struggling get fined. And if they can't pay those fines, their vehicle can be taken, which means losing both shelter and transportation at the same time. And while some cities have started safe parking programs that offer designated spaces and basic support, they only serve a fraction of the People who need them and don't address the deeper issue, which is that housing has become unaffordable for a growing number of working people. And when you step back and look at all of this, it stops being a question of individual choices and starts looking like a system where the math no longer works. Because a full-time job is supposed to provide basic stability, and in more places it doesn't. And once that gap opens, it spreads, first affecting those already on the edge and then reaching people who never expected to be at risk, until situations that once seemed unthinkable, like working full-time and still not having a home, start to become more common. And the most unsettling part is that much of this remains hidden in plain sight, in parked cars, quiet streets, everyday spaces where nothing looks out of place, and most people pass by without realizing what they're seeing. Because the people inside are doing everything they can to remain invisible. And that invisibility makes the crisis feel smaller than it is, easier to ignore. But it's there, woven into the same places we move through every day. And once you understand that, you start to notice the details you didn't before, and that car outside the grocery store doesn't look quite the same anymore. Because tomorrow morning it will be gone, the person inside will go back to work, continue their routine, and most people will never realize they were looking at someone without a home. And once you start noticing it, it becomes harder to ignore how fragile the line really is between being housed and not. Because for a lot of people it isn't some distant edge, it's a few paychecks, one emergency, one unexpected shift in circumstances. And what makes this even more unsettling is that the system isn't designed to catch people quickly once they start falling. It slows them down instead. Because without a permanent address, simple things become complicated: job applications, bank accounts, government assistance, even receiving basic mail. Everything starts requiring extra steps, extra time, extra proof. And when you're already exhausted and trying to hold on to a job, those extra barriers add up fast. And while from the outside it might look like people just need help and support, the reality is that accessing that help often feels like navigating a maze with no clear entry point, long wait lists, strict eligibility rules, limited availability, and in many cases programs that were never scaled to handle this many people in the first place. So even when someone is actively trying to get back into stable housing, doing everything right, making calls, filling out forms, showing up to appointments, progress can be painfully slow, and time is exactly what they don't have. Because the longer someone remains in that unstable situation, the harder it becomes to break out of it. Physically, mentally, and financially. And this is where the conversation often shifts into something uncomfortable, because it forces a question that doesn't have an easy answer. If the people experiencing this aren't disconnected from society, if they're working, contributing, trying to stay afloat, then what does that say about the structure around them? About a system where stability depends not just on effort, but on whether the numbers happen to work in your favor, and right now for a growing number of people they don't. And that's why this issue keeps expanding quietly, not through one dramatic event, but through thousands of individual situations where the math simply stops adding up, and each one of those situations doesn't always look like a crisis from the outside. It looks ordinary, routine, almost invisible, which is exactly why it continues to grow without drawing the level of attention it probably should. Because it doesn't disrupt daily life in an obvious way for most people. It blends into it. And that makes it easier to overlook, easier to assume it's not widespread, easier to believe it's happening somewhere else. But the reality is it's already part of the same environment, the same economy, the same set of pressures that millions of people are navigating every day. And the difference between those who fall into it and those who don't is often much smaller than people expect. Which is why understanding it matters, not just as a distant social issue, but as something that reflects how the system is functioning as a whole. Because when basic stability becomes this difficult to maintain, even for people who are doing everything expected of them, it's not just an individual problem anymore. It's a signal that something deeper isn't working the way it should. And this is usually where people start asking what the solution is. And the honest answer is that there isn't one simple fix. Because this didn't come from one single cause. It came from years of decisions that slowly pushed housing further out of reach while assuming the system would somehow balance itself. And it didn't. And now the response often focuses on the visible symptoms instead of the underlying pressure, moving people along, clearing areas, enforcing rules that make the situation less noticeable without actually changing it. And that might create the appearance of improvement for a moment, but it doesn't reduce the number of people who are struggling to find a place to live. It just shifts where you see them, and real solutions tend to look less immediate and more structural. Building more housing that people can actually afford, adjusting policies that restrict supply, creating support systems that are accessible before someone loses housing instead of after, and strengthening wages so that full-time work once again aligns with basic living costs. But those kinds of changes take time, coordination, and political will, which means in the meantime people are still navigating the reality as it exists right now, figuring out where to park tonight, how to stay safe, how to hold on to a job while everything else feels uncertain. And it's easy to look at that and feel like it's too complex, too big. And this is usually where people start asking what the solution is. And the honest answer is that there isn't one simple fix, because this didn't come from one single cause. It came from years of decisions that slowly pushed housing further out of reach while assuming the system would somehow balance itself. And it didn't. And now the response often focuses on the visible symptoms instead of the underlying pressure, moving people along, clearing areas, enforcing rules that make the situation less noticeable without actually changing it. And that might create the appearance of improvement for a moment, but it doesn't reduce the number of people who are struggling to find a place to live. It just shifts where you see them, and real solutions tend to look less immediate and more structural. Building more housing that people can actually afford, adjusting policies that restrict supply, creating support systems that are accessible before someone loses housing instead of after, and strengthening wages so that full-time work once again aligns with basic living costs. But those kinds of changes take time, coordination, and political will, which means in the meantime people are still navigating the reality as it exists right now, figuring out where to park tonight, how to stay safe, how to hold on to a job while everything else feels uncertain. And it's easy to look at that and feel like it's too complex, too big. And maybe the most unsettling part is how easy it is to miss all of this when you are not the one living it. Because from the outside, everything still looks functional. People are still working, still commuting, still showing up. Everyday cities are still moving, lights are still on, businesses are still running. Nothing about the surface suggests a system under pressure, but underneath that surface, millions of people are holding their lives together with almost no room for error. One unexpected expense, one delayed paycheck, one small disruption is all it takes to push everything off balance. And when that happens, it does not look dramatic. It looks quiet. It looks like cutting back. It looks like stress that nobody talks about. It looks like people disappearing from spaces they used to be part of. It looks like isolation and constant calculation. And the reason this matters is because when a large number of people start living like this, it stops being a personal issue and starts becoming a collective one. It affects how people spend, how they save, how they plan their future. It changes risk-taking. It changes mental health. It changes entire communities slowly over time. And yet, because it happens gradually, it rarely gets treated with the urgency it deserves. People adapt. Instead of reacting, they normalize. Instead of questioning, and the cycle continues, tightening a little more each year. And this is where awareness becomes more than just understanding. It becomes a form of protection, because once you recognize the pattern, you start seeing it everywhere, in rising costs, in shrinking margins, in the way stability now requires more effort than it used to. And that recognition allows you to move differently, not perfectly, not without pressure, but with intention and clarity. And that is what separates those who stay trapped in the cycle from those who slowly find ways to step outside of it. Because while the system may not change overnight, your response to it can, and sometimes that small shift. And the truth that lingers after everything is said is simple but hard to ignore. This is not a rare situation anymore. This is not something happening to a small group on the margins. This is spreading quietly into what used to be considered normal, stable working life. And that changes how we need to think about it. Because when people who are doing everything right still feel financially fragile, the issue is no longer about individual discipline. It is about the environment they are operating in. An environment where costs rise faster than comfort, where security feels temporary, and where the line between stable and struggling is thinner than most people realize. And that line is where millions are standing right now, balancing carefully, trying not to fall, adjusting constantly, just to stay in place. And that is exhausting in a way that is hard to explain unless you are living it. Because it is not just physical effort, it is mental. It is the constant awareness that things can shift at any moment. And that awareness follows you everywhere, into your decisions, your plans, your sleep, your sense of control over your own life. And yet, even in that reality, there is something important to hold on to, which is that understanding this clearly changes how you move forward. It pushes you to focus on what actually creates stability, not just what looks like it from the outside. It encourages you to build slowly, intentionally, even if progress feels less visible, even if it does not match what others are doing, because in a system that rewards appearance and speed, choosing sustainability and control is a different kind of advantage, one that does not collapse as easily under pressure. And maybe that is where the real shift happens, not in escaping the system completely, but in learning how to exist within it without letting it quietly dictate every outcome. Because once you reach that point, even if nothing around you changes immediately, something inside you does, and that change is often where a more Department of Health and Human Services suggests that roughly 70% of individuals who reach age 65 will require some form of long-term care during their lifetime. The average duration is about 3 years, but a significant percentage of people will need care for longer periods. That means this isn't a rare scenario, it's a likely one. And yet, most households enter retirement without a concrete plan to address it. There is, in theory, a tool designed for this exact purpose: long-term care insurance. But over the past decade, premiums for these policies have increased substantially, and coverage terms have become more restrictive. As a result, many of the households that would benefit most from this protection find it either too expensive or too uncertain to rely on. That leaves two primary alternatives. One is to pay out of pocket, which, for most families, means drawing down retirement savings at an accelerated pace. The other is to rely on Medicaid, which does cover long-term care, but only after individuals have spent down most of their assets to qualify. In practical terms, that often means the financial resources built over a lifetime are largely exhausted before assistance becomes available. There's also a timing issue that rarely gets enough attention. Many people retire before they're eligible for Medicare, which begins at age 65. That creates a coverage gap, sometimes lasting several years, where individuals must rely on private health insurance. During this window, premiums can be high, especially for older adults without employer-sponsored coverage. And this expense arrives at the exact moment income from work stops. It's a transition period that can quietly strain even well-prepared households before any major health event ever occurs. What makes healthcare costs uniquely challenging is that they don't just require money, they require flexibility. You can cut back on discretionary spending. You can downsize your home. And in the end, what stays with you is not just the pressure or the numbers, or even the struggle itself. It is the realization that so much of what people are experiencing right now has been quietly normalized to the point where it almost goes unquestioned. The constant balancing, the silent stress, the need to calculate every decision. These are not small things, but they have become part of everyday life for millions. And when something that heavy starts to feel ordinary, it changes how people see themselves. It changes what they expect from the future. It changes how much they believe is possible. And that is where the real impact sits, not just in financial strain, but in the way it shapes mindset over time. Because when stability feels uncertain, people stop planning long-term, they stop taking risks, they start focusing only on getting through the next week, the next month, the next bill, and slowly that short-term thinking becomes a survival pattern rather than a choice, and breaking out of that pattern does not happen overnight. It takes awareness, it takes small consistent shifts, it takes a willingness to step outside of what everyone else appears to be doing and focus on what actually works in your reality. And that process is not easy, it is not fast, and it is rarely visible from the outside, but it is real, and it is happening in small ways for people who decide to respond differently to the pressure around them, not by ignoring it, not by pretending it does not exist, but by understanding it clearly and adjusting their approach accordingly. And maybe that is the most honest way to look at all of this, not as a story with a perfect ending, but as an ongoing situation that requires a different kind of awareness, a different kind of thinking, and a different definition of what it means to truly be stable in a world where the old definitions no longer hold the same meaning, and where the ability to adapt thoughtfully may be one of the most valuable skills anyone can have moving forward. For tens of millions of Americans, retirement doesn't rest on investment portfolios or carefully constructed withdrawal strategies. It rests on a single, predictable monthly payment, Social Security. Strip that away, And the financial picture for a large portion of older households changes immediately and dramatically. Studies have shown that without Social Security, poverty rates among Americans over 65 would rise sharply. For many retirees, it isn't a supplement to other income. It is the income. It covers rent, groceries, utilities, and basic health care. It's the foundation everything else sits on. And for a long time, that foundation felt stable. The system was designed as a safety net, not a complete solution, but one people could rely on. The concern now isn't about whether Social Security exists today. It does, and it continues to function as intended. The concern is about what happens over the next decade if no structural changes are made. According to projections from the Social Security Administration, the program's primary trust fund is expected to face a funding shortfall in the early 2030s. At that point, incoming payroll tax revenue would be sufficient to cover roughly 77% of scheduled benefits. That implies an automatic reduction of about 23% unless Congress intervenes. It's important to understand what that means in real terms. The system doesn't collapse. Payments don't disappear. But for someone relying on that monthly check to cover essential expenses, a 20+% reduction isn't theoretical. It's immediate. It's rent that can't be fully paid, prescriptions that get delayed, trade-offs that weren't part of the original plan. And that potential shift doesn't just affect people already retired. It changes behavior long before any adjustment is made. Confidence is a critical part of any financial system. When people believe a program will deliver what it promises, they plan around it. When that belief starts to weaken, planning itself begins to change. Older workers delay retirement because they're unsure if their benefits will be enough. Some who have already retired re-enter the workforce, not because they want to, but because the margin feels too thin. Younger workers, watching the same projections, begin to question whether the system will exist in its current form by the time they reach retirement age. And that doubt doesn't usually show up as panic. It shows up as quiet disengagement, less reliance, less long-term planning, more uncertainty about what the future actually looks like. And when enough people start operating under that uncertainty, something subtle but significant happens. The traditional model of retirement, the idea that you work for a defined period, step away at a predictable age, and live on a combination of savings and guaranteed income, starts to lose its clarity. It becomes less of a destination and more of a moving target. So people adapt, not always in obvious ways, but in ways that signal a deeper shift in how retirement is understood. When a system stops feeling reliable, people don't wait for an official announcement to change their behavior. They adjust quietly, in ways that don't always make headlines, but show up clearly in the data. One of the most visible shifts is happening in the workforce itself. Today, more than 11 million Americans aged 65 and older are still working, a figure that has more than doubled since the mid-1990s. Some of that reflects choice. People living longer, staying active, wanting purpose. But a growing portion reflects something less voluntary. Many simply can't afford to stop. This creates a tension that didn't define retirement in the same way a generation ago. Stop working too early, and you risk outliving your savings. Keep working too long, and health may eventually force you out on terms you didn't choose. There's no clean resolution to that trade-off. Instead, it produces a kind of low-grade, persistent financial anxiety that follows people into what were once expected to be their most secure years. And rather than a clear endpoint, retirement becomes something more fluid, less a moment, more a transition. You can see that transition in how people are structuring their later years. Instead of fully exiting the workforce, many shift into part-time roles, consulting, gig work, or reduced schedules. Income doesn't stop, it tapers. On the surface, that can look like flexibility, even freedom. But underneath, it's also a signal. The traditional model, work for decades, retire fully at a fixed age, live off accumulated savings, is no longer functioning the way it was designed to for a large share of the population. At the same time, there's a quieter shift happening in mindset. When people run the numbers and realize the gap between where they are and where they're told they need to be, some don't respond by trying to close it. They step away from the framework entirely, not out of ignorance, but out of arithmetic. If the target feels unreachable, continuing to optimize toward it can start to feel irrational. So instead, they reorient. For some, that means prioritizing the present. spending more of what they earn now, focusing on quality of life today rather than deferring everything for a future that feels uncertain. There's a logic to that approach, especially when projections about healthcare costs, market returns, and Social Security all carry a degree of unpredictability. But it also comes with trade-offs, particularly later in life, when expenses tend to become less flexible and more medically driven. Others attempt a different kind of adjustment, changing the environment rather than the plan. Downsizing homes, relocating to lower-cost regions, sometimes even moving internationally in search of a more manageable cost structure. These strategies can create breathing room, and for some households, they work, but they don't eliminate the underlying pressures. Property taxes, insurance, healthcare, and basic living costs don't disappear. They follow you, even if in different forms. Then there's a path that's less often discussed openly, but increasingly common in practice: reliance on public support systems. Programs designed as safety nets become primary sources of stability. For some, this reflects long-term financial hardship. For others, it reflects a gradual realization that the traditional path didn't deliver the expected outcome. Either way, it points to a broader shift. Retirement is becoming less about independence and more about adaptation. None of these responses fully resolve the core issue. They redistribute it. They buy time, create flexibility, or reduce exposure, but they don't restore the original promise the system was built around. And the fact that so many people are making these adjustments at once tells you something important. This isn't confusion. It's recognition. People see the math. They understand the gap. And increasingly, their response isn't to try harder within the same framework. It's to question whether that framework still makes sense at all. Which brings us to the part of the conversation that rarely gets addressed directly. Not the numbers, not the behavior, but the way the entire situation has been framed for decades.